Hello and welcome to the Horror Homestead. My name is GiBi. Merry Christmas. Happy December 25th. I hope that your day is treating you well, and if it's not, then you can always watch this video to maybe cheer yourself up. And if it is, you can still watch the video. I'm going to be answering some questions I've been getting in my comment section recently. This is the FNAF community update. Let's go. Unwithered Truth, that's another FNAF YouTuber you guys should totally check out, made a really good point in his video talking about the canon of FNAF, in that we as a fan base tend to automatically associate something non-canon as having no worth intrinsically, which is just a terrible way to engage with storytelling. At this point in my life as a FNAF fan, I'm reading these books, not because I think they'll solve the timeline of the games. Frankly, I don't think anything outside of a very lengthy and in-detail PDF from Mr. Scott Cawthon can do that, but because I want to genuinely engage with the content critically and earnestly. I also watched the video where Unwithered Truth talked about this, and I disagreed to a small extent because obviously the FNAF movie was incredibly successful and a lot of people, especially fans, loved it, and we all knew going in that wasn't going to be canon. But I do agree that a lot of people tend to devalue things if they're not canon, and I've actually seen this in other franchises. Some franchises have what I'm going to call homework, which I think most people would often associate with the MCU, where there's certain movies or TV shows that people would consider to be less interesting than others, with the most interesting obviously being the big Avengers movies, but the more interesting entries being Captain America, Iron Man, Spider-Man, etc. And so they see the other side movies, especially one-offs, something like currently Shang-Chi or the Eternals, etc., as, oh, I have to do homework so I know who this guy is when he shows up in the next movie I actually want to watch. And so they'll go to big fans who watch everything and be like, do I have to watch this one? Do I have to watch that one? And then back in the day, there was always the answer of like, well, technically you don't need to watch any of the X-Men movies because they're not canon, but you really should if you want to get all the jokes, and that's just exhausting. If you don't try to make this franchise, this IP, this one brand, your entire life and identity and do the homework, it's confusing, it's exhausting. And so if you like FNAF, but the thing that brought you in was the lore, was game theory videos, was wanting to find out what happened, and someone goes, oh, you like FNAF? You should try this thing that's not even canon. Well then yeah, you're gonna be like, well, that's not scratching the itch that I'm here for, so I'm not going to engage with it. The same way that people who saw the first Avengers when they were 6 and were like, oh my god, this is the greatest thing ever, don't necessarily want to watch Moon Knight on Disney+. So I do understand that. I just don't necessarily think that it's a problem, because everyone's going to engage with the franchise at different levels. Back when the Star Wars continuity was reset after Disney bought Star Wars, I wanted to read every single book and every single comic book and watch every single TV show that was considered canon. I was a diehard, and still am a diehard Star Wars fan. But there was so much that it became physically impossible to keep up with it. Unless I made Star Wars my full-time job, like making a YouTube channel about it, I would literally never be able to keep up with the amount of content. There's some Star Wars YouTubers who don't even keep up with absolutely everything. And so I get it from a casual perspective, being told that there's all these books to read, all these games to play, you gotta pick and choose, you gotta prioritize. And so we're in this really weird place where some people think that the Tales from the Pizzaplex books are canon and some people don't. And so if you're that group of FNAF fans who really only want to deal with the canon material so they can solve the lore, now you're in a pickle, because you don't necessarily want to commit to reading all these books. It's like a lot of books, it's so many books, guys. You don't want to read all these books if they end up not being canon, but if they are canon, you do want to know what's going on. And so the debate rages, and the debate will continue to rage. And that's not a bug, it's a feature. I think this would be very easily solved if Scott just came out and told us what was canon and not canon. I have a video about why I don't think that the Tiger Rock plush being in Help Wanted 2 means that the Stitch line, not Stitch line, the other thing, the Mimic line. What is the Mimic line but basically just mimicking the Stitch line if you really think about it? But I made a video about why the Tiger Rock plush in Help Wanted 2 does not actually confirm that the Mimic line from the books is canon. I bring up tons of other examples of other franchises and how they have these crossovers and these different continuities and things like that, but what separates FNAF from those other franchises is that Scott just refuses to tell us what counts. And the theory is that he refuses to tell us because if he tells us it's not canon, fewer people will read the books and fewer people will buy the books and spend the money. So I get it, but once the series is over, like Fazbear Frights, and like you're not really making money from it as much as you were when they were coming out anymore, that's when you should come out and say, oh yeah, that was never canon. Or it was canon. Once its like shelf life has expired, I think that's the time when Scott should come out and tell us the truth. Bringing up the MCU again, after the first Avengers movie, the show Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. came out on ABC, was a network television show. This is before streaming really took off, and that show was advertised as being canon. The tagline of the MCU back then was, "It's all connected." And so when you watched Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. and Nick Fury showed up, or Thor's female Asgardian friend, I forget her name, or she showed up on the show, then that means that the show matters, and that the people on the show might end up showing up in the movies. Due to a very complicated series of events where the Marvel TV shows and the Marvel movies were run by two different guys who didn't like each other, and the show people kept saying, "We're canon," and the movie people kept saying, "You're not canon," but then they advertised themselves as being canon, whatever, it's a mess. Anyway, after the show ended, they came out and said, because this guy got fired, so Kevin Feige came out and said, Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. was never canon and is not canon. Meaning we have this entire show that people like myself watched because we thought it was canon to the MCU that has now been completely decanonized, and we were told that we were wrong the whole time, the marketing was wrong, we were lied to. And that sucks, because I love Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. The first few seasons, not the last 2 seasons as much. Once the guy, exploded himself in a rocket ship, I'm like, okay, I can stop watching. But I have a friend who recently got into the video game Marvel Rivals, and so he wanted to catch up and watch everything in the MCU, including all of the TV shows on Disney+. And he asked me for a list of all the canon shows, and I gave it to him. And I told him, Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. isn't canon. And he was like, ooh, what a sigh of relief, I don't need to watch all that. And that sucks, because I like Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. But I also understand that if he only cares about what's canon, he's not gonna watch it. And so yeah, Scott does have a reason to not tell us that Fazbear Frights isn't canon, because then people won't read it. Obviously, I still would, because I'm making this my job, and because I do want to hear Scott's story, because even though he's not physically writing the books, he is coming up with the story ideas. And so, like Ben Welsh says, we think it's important to, genuinely engage with the content critically and earnestly. But for the sake of the health of the community, I think that Scott should clarify. It's like the #1 thing people are fighting over right now, and I just wish that they wouldn't. Okay, this is a really interesting comment. So in my video about Lonely Freddy, I talk about how there's an entire paragraph where the main character, Alec, is looking at his mother and his mother's sister, his aunt, and is like, oh, I'm nothing like my mom, but I look just like her, therefore I must be her daughter, right? Like, I'm not secretly my aunt's son or something. And I go off on this rant about how that's just literally not how genetics work. Ultimately, all your genes are coming from your grandparents, and there's some traits that could show themselves or be recessive. So let's say that your mom has blonde hair and your aunt has red hair, and you're born with blonde hair. You can't go, oh, I must be my mother's son because I also have blonde hair. That's not how that works. You could also have red hair. Your cousin could have blonde hair. Like, it just didn't work. It's wrong. And so this person's pointing out the sentence about Alec looking like his mom, then his maternal aunt, could just mean that he's bad at genetics, lol. So that's a very Watsonian perspective on this topic. There's Doylean and there's Watsonian. This comes from the Sherlock Holmes book. So Doylean is talking about a work from the perspective of the author out of the universe. So when I'm complaining and saying, genetics don't work like that, that's coming from the Doylean perspective of the human being writing this book didn't understand genetics and thus wrote this paragraph wrong. The Watsonian perspective comes from the fact that the character Watson is the narrator in the Sherlock Holmes books. They're all his writings. He writes down these adventures that him and Sherlock go on. And so the perspective that the reason the paragraph is wrong is because Alec the narrator is wrong is a Watsonian perspective. It's, oh, the narrator thinks this, and thus it is stated, as opposed to the author thinks this, and thus it is stated. And those are both two very interesting ways of looking at media, and I think that they're both equally as important, and that you typically should look at media both ways. And that specifically because I'm viewing the Fazbear Fright stories as being in-universe novels, I do have to look at them both ways. Because if I only look at them Watsonianly from Alec's perspective as opposed to the author's perspective, I'd be missing out on the possibility that the author is actually a character, which makes the Doylean part Watsonian. It's a whole thing. It's a whole thing. Is this wrong because Alec thinks it's wrong? Is this wrong because the in-universe author gets it wrong? Or is it wrong because the real-world author gets it wrong? I don't know, let's talk about it. You didn't need to invoke Nietzsche to tell us this crusty bear story sucks. I disagree. So once again, in my Lonely Freddy video, I stopped for a very long time and I talk about philosophy. I actually had my brother, who has long played a character on my channel named Dr. Professor Sleeve McDykel, come up with a very long essay that he wrote about the philosophy that's embedded into the Lonely Freddy story. So we talked about Nietzsche, and we talked about Kant, and we talked about Plato, and I think it's very important to look at what an author is trying to say about a piece of work. Again, that would kind of be like a Doylean thing, but it's more like anti-death of the author, where I think it's really important to look at what the author is trying to say with whatever work they're making. And so that's also why I talk about things like LGBT themes and references to Jesus and the Bible, because when anyone's making any sort of artistic work, it's always going to be in conversation with very important things like their identity, their personal philosophy, the world around them. And so knowing the history and the context in which they're made, knowing the person's identity and what that means to them, so that would be something like the year that they're born, right, like the decade that they're born and they grew up in. It would be things like sex, like gender, like race, like sexuality. That stuff's important to talk about. And then philosophies are also important to talk about, and you can throw religion in there. Coming from a mainly Christian culture or a non-mainly Christian culture matters. Being Christian yourself or not matters. Having, believing in Kant's ethics versus Nietzsche's ethics versus or Descartes or Plato or nothing is also important. Even if the author's beliefs aren't important, they might be giving the character beliefs based on their own understanding of these beliefs that they don't even have. And so yes, even for something as silly as the Scare Bear books, this is important. If we're talking about a character who fits into Nietzsche's view of the world, it's possible that the author intended that character to fit into Nietzsche's view of the world, and so you gotta talk about Nietzsche. I'm determined to pronounce Nietzsche as many different ways as possible. Nietzsche. Nietzsche. This very long comment, which I thank you, Porcelain Chips, for writing it, but I'm not going to read the whole thing, but it's basically saying that Scott wrote his stories and then has given other people the ability to write their own stories, not wanting the continuities to get crisscrossed. Basically giving them room to tell their stories in different continuities. And this is very interesting coming, again, I'm going to relate this to the Star Wars fandom. It's very interesting coming from a Star Wars fan because something very similar is happening over in that franchise. When Disney bought Star Wars, they said, from now on, everything is canon. Nothing will be contradicted at any point. And that was just a complete lie. There is a book about the character Ahsoka in which she undergoes certain events. She meets some characters and fights some guys. And then in the show, Tales of the Jedi, we learn what Ahsoka was doing at the exact same time period that the book was happening. And very, very similar events to that book happened in the show, but the names are changed, and some of the circumstances are different. So the show and the book completely conflict with each other, but they're basically telling the same story, so they're parallels of each other. Which one is canon? I'll answer that in a second. There was a comic book that came out when Star Wars Rebels was starting. It was about the character Kanan and how he was almost killed during Order 66. And then many years later, the show Star Wars The Bad Batch's pilot opens with Kanan and how he was almost killed during Order 66, but it's a completely different story, so one of them is canon and one of them's not. Which is it? Well, the answer that Star Wars Disney Dave Filoni gave us was that Star Wars doesn't have a real canon, because all the movies and everything starts with a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away. Everything is just a fairy tale, and thus in two different retellings of the same events, there can be minor or major differences told between them. Because we're not actually watching the real history, we're reading a fairy tale, and so some details have changed. This is also the explanation given to us from Nintendo about the Legend of Zelda series. They're all legends, and thus if the canon of two different games conflict with each other, it's because one of them was wrong and things were just mistranslated over time. I know that this is gonna piss a lot of people off. Someone told me they think pissed is a bad word. Maybe I shouldn't say pissed anymore. I know this is gonna peeve a lot of people, but for this exact same reason, I think it is very likely that Tales from the Pizzaplex, even if it does end up being canon, even if we are supposed to look at it for clues, even if it's not about parallels, but Tales from the Pizzaplex, which I currently hold no opinion on if it's canon or not, Tales from the Pizzaplex might differ in canon from the games, merely because they are tales from the Pizzaplex. The same way that the Legend of Zelda are legends, and Star Wars is a fairy tale a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away, a fairy tale. Tales from the Pizzaplex might just be tales, and thus even if they're based 99% in real life on things that happened in the actual continuity, doesn't mean that some details might not conflict with each other. The series is literally advertised as being tales, as being not true, embellished, game of telephoned away from reality. Having not read all the stories yet, I'm not going to hardline say that I don't think the books are canon, but I am going to say that just from my vantage point, from the way that the books are advertised and the way that this works in other franchises, I probably do not think that the Tales from the Pizzaplex books were ever intended to be canon, because they're called Tales from the Pizzaplex, which also invokes things like Tales from the Crypt, the old anthology TV show that was kind of like The Twilight Zone, where you're just hearing stories. There's a storyteller, ironically a character called the Storyteller. It's called the Crypt Keeper in Tales from the Crypt. So in Tales from the Pizzaplex, maybe there's a storyteller. It doesn't make it not true, it just means you're sort of learning things through the skewed lens of the storyteller. The same way I just explained the Watsonian and the Doylean perspective, and also talked about how the main character can have a bias, the person telling the story can have a bias, and the real-world author can be wrong. In Tales from the Pizzaplex, any details we get could be biased from the fact that they are having a main character that could be biased, having a teller of the tale that could be biased, and then details could be wrong. For example, we know now that Scott gave a lot of information to Steelwool that they then mistranslated into Security Breach. So if there's something that contradicts Security Breach in Tales from the Pizzaplex, we don't know if the main character is biased, we don't know if the person telling the tale has got some details wrong, or we don't know if there were real-world miscommunications between Scott and the author of the book and Scott and Steelwool. It's very confusing. I just want him to answer. I know he won't. I don't think he actually should until the entire series is over, maybe after Secret of the Mimic. I wish he would. I forget where I was going with this. Zelda and Star Wars. Play Zelda if you like FNAF. They have nothing to do with each other. They're nothing alike. Going back to Lonely Freddy, because a lot of people have a lot of thoughts about Lonely Freddy, but Hazel, the girl with the name normally given to someone with hazel eyes, has bright green eyes, the same color as Alec after he gets Lonely Freddy'd. What if Hazel was Lonely Freddy'd way before the story starts? I love this, because I also picked up that it's weird that Hazel doesn't have hazel eyes, and if Lonely Freddy's have bright green eyes, which is the same color as Hazel does in the main story, and if Alec's eyes change color after he swaps souls with Lonely Freddy, then maybe Hazel's eyes changed color. It's really weird because you think like his parents would notice that his eyes changed color. So maybe he didn't notice when Hazel's eyes changed color, maybe it sort of like retroactively makes your eyes a different color. Like everyone always thinks that you had green eyes even though they used to be brown. Don't know, very interesting. I love that someone noticed this. So in my video talking about whether or not Tales was canon, I said that even if characters like Edwin and David and the Mimic were canon, and even if the origin story of the Mimic where Dave is running out on the road and there is a car and it is going to hit him, if that really happened, it doesn't mean that all the other stories that are tied to it in the Tales from the Pizzaplex books are canon. It doesn't mean GiBi is canon, and it doesn't mean that the Mimic epilogues in which a group of teenagers break into the construction site for the Pizzaplex and then get killed by the Mimic doesn't mean that that's canon. So when At Wit's End asked, hey, what tell story is a bunch of teens killed in a warehouse, may I ask? That's the Mimic epilogues in which a bunch of teens are killed by the Mimic. Nguyen Xander asks, the FNAF newspapers say that 2 children were lured into the safe room on June 26th. Supposedly the 3rd and 5th children in Toy Chica's high school years. Does that mean William killed them all on the same day? Because if he killed the 3rd and the 5th on the same day, he would have at least have to kill the 4th on the same day as well. So if we're taking Toy Chica's high school years as the kill order, and we know that Susie was lured into the back. If Susie was the first and Susie was lured to the back, that means that all the other killings were on the same day because it was the next day that he was caught, right? Yeah, so I guess that has to make sense. So one of the important things is that the newspaper says that 5 disappearances are tied to the incident. For me, what's super important about that, because I think that Charlie was one of the MCI people, I have a video about that you can go watch. But because I think Charlie was one of the MCI people, that would mean that William killed 4 people on the same day. Susie, and then the 3 boys. So yes, that does mean that. I think that answers your question. How is Charlie tied into the MCI in your cast a DCI theory? Elizabeth doesn't go missing out of Freddy's. We have no idea what the public thinks happened to Elizabeth, but at the very least she goes missing at a Circus Baby Pizza World. I also think that Elizabeth died after the MCI. I think that the MCI happened, well, I think Charlie dies, and then I think the MCI happens, and I think Freddy's closes, and then Circus Babies opens, and then Elizabeth is killed, and then that closes, and then Circus Baby rental happens. So that's what I think, and your response is William wouldn't want to kill because the MCI was to test possession, and he only knew about possession after Elizabeth's death. So from the, let's test what we've all learned today, from the Watsonian perspective, the in-universe perspective, I think the answer to that question is that William probably noticed that either Dave's plush had some amount of possession in it after his death, or that the puppet had some amount of possession in it after Charlie's death, and that would lead him to go and do the MCI. From a Doyleist perspective, from the author of the story perspective, Elizabeth doesn't exist until sister location. So William's backstory had to make sense before the character of Elizabeth, before him having a daughter, ever even happened. Like, all this stuff, the FNAF 1, 2, and 3 are a self-contained story. If the story had ended there, no one would be asking, why did William kill the kids before Elizabeth died? Because Elizabeth didn't exist. So obviously there was a reason, from the author's perspective, for William to do the killing that had nothing to do with Elizabeth. And so I think that there is a reason. It's because the answer is just that he saw other people dying and he wanted to test it. Maybe he was just a mad scientist and wanted to do it himself. But I think the most likely answer is that he saw Dave's toy, Golden Freddy toy thing become possessed, or he saw the puppet. Totally serious question that's definitely worth considering. Do you think that Scott Cawthon specifically chose songs he hated to be sung by Freddy and Co. in the movie, since FNAF 1 Phone Guy says those same stupid songs? No, because I think one of the main songs used in the movie that Freddy sung is extremely important to the lore. I was going to make a video about that, but then you guys voted and said that you wanted to make a video about Mrs. Afton, so I did that instead. Sure is funny that Freddy in the movie sings a song and says, oh, all the secrets that you keep while you're talking in your sleep, which I guess in the real world is a song about, like, infidelity, but in the movie it's a song about Mike's dream theory. Mike's dream. I think it's lore important. Can we get an interpollistic shirt, please? I spent months designing my Scare Bear shirt. I invented yellow Scare Bear. I invented the purple fella. I made the logo for the Aftari 8500. I made mugs with these guys. I have a horror Homestead hat. I had to go through multiple different print-on-demand services because I didn't like Teespring, and I eventually settled on Fourth Wall because I think that they genuinely have the best quality stuff, just so I could bring you guys funny Scare Bear shirt. And now you just want a shirt that says interpollistic? Okay. How come Springtrap can't have a kid? I mean, is there any evidence suggesting otherwise? No, technically not. I think that what is absolutely confirmed is actually very few things in the series. So can Springtrap father a child while they're Springtrap? Maybe. Someone should make a video about the things that are actually canon in FNAF so that we can just go and check the list and see, oh, is it canon that Springtrap can't have children? No. Maybe it's possible then. And now I want to move on from questions to the community update portion of the video. This is where I talk about videos and news and ongoing things that are happening within the community. Beyond the continual debate about whether or not the books are canon, there have been two big videos that I've seen released in the community over the last few days. Two big topics, I should say. The first, which everybody's asking me to cover, is the new theory from Cryonides about Lefty the animatronic from FNAF 6. Together on a live stream, they discussed some evidence and came to a conclusion that they believe that the DCI kids are inside Lefty from FNAF 6. There's some evidence that points this way if you interpret it in a specific manner. For example, in UCN, Lefty tells the player, who is probably William, that there is room for one more, one of the people inside being Charlie, and so possibly other people inside are the DCI kids. It would also answer what happened to the DCI kids. It also makes sense because Lefty kinda looks like the older animatronics. I'm never going to explain their theory and their evidence as well as their videos do, so I'm going to link them both in the description. Once again, they came up with this on a live stream, but then both individually put out videos discussing them. They also talk about other topics. A lot of people seem very convinced by this theory, and a lot of the sentiment that I see revolving around why it's so convincing is that it answers questions. Oh, now we know what happened to the DCI. Oh, now we know what happened with Lefty. Oh, now we know Henry's plan. And this is what I'm talking about when I say that certain evidence can be compelling to some people and not compelling to others. Because for all the people who are saying, oh my god, this makes perfect sense now, there's also people saying that these mysteries didn't really need solving. We know why Lefty exists. He exists to capture the puppet. We know what happened to the toy animatronics. They were dismantled, and then parts of them were put in the FNAF 3 location, and that place burned down, so if there was any remnant left in their suits, it was destroyed in that fire. I'm a proponent that the DCI didn't even happen, so I'm not looking for an answer for that. But these videos' popularity show that there is a hunger in the fandom for answers to these long-sought questions, that evidence from a game as old as FNAF 6 can still be used to solve a lot of mysteries in the franchise, and that mysteries that have existed since FNAF 2, a 10-year-old game, are still things that people are interested in. I love that people are still looking for theories and evidence in these old games, and I can't wait to hear more from these creators. The second video I want to talk about is from YouTuber Mahogany. They have a video called Unsolving Molten MCI, which just goes straight to my heart, because I have my video called Unsolving Midnight Motorist. And yes, I am totally on board with people just looking at other theories and going, we have no idea what's happening. With that said, I thought the video was going to be going over why Molten MCI isn't true, and I went in with a very open mind, expecting to hear a lot of evidence, conflicting with the overall theory, and maybe you could change my mind, but no, it actually ended up being probably one of the best laid out explanations of Molten MCI. It goes over the evidence and the counter evidence. It goes over why it's silly, but also why it's almost certainly true. Mahogany only has 3 videos on his channel. 2 of them have under 3,000 views and the other has 77,000. That's just the YouTube algorithm for you, but all 3 of his videos are phenomenal. I highly recommend his channel. He has a good way of talking, and I expect great things from him in the future. Thank you for watching. Be sure to be nice to each other in the comments. Consider supporting the creators you admire. Never lose sight of the things that are important to you. Have a very, very Merry Christmas. Remember that FREDDY stands for Friendly, Respectful, Engagement, Discussion, and Discourse Yield Success. And I'll see you on Sunday for my discussion of the second Stitch Wraith Stinger epilogue in the book Fetch.